It all started on a quiet Saturday morning when I grabbed my toolbox and headed out to work on something that meant a lot to me, my 150-year-old barn. This barn has been in my family for generations, and after years of neglect, I finally had the time and energy to start restoring it. I wasn't tearing anything down or building a skyscraper, just fixing up old wood, repainting, replacing a few worn-out beams. But apparently, that was too much for the local HOA. Out of nowhere, a board member walked up, clipboard in hand, acting like I was setting off fireworks in a no-burn zone. She told me I needed approval to make changes to my own property. I tried to explain that this barn predates the neighborhood itself, but she wasn't having it. A few hours later, 2 squad cars rolled up my gravel driveway. Yep, they actually called the police on me. For repairing my own barn, I was stunned, but I didn't get angry. Not right away, anyway. I just knew one thing. If they wanted to play games, they picked the wrong person. What the HOA didn't know was that I happened to work in infrastructure, specifically utility planning. I knew exactly how power grids were managed in the area, and more importantly, how much influence I had in determining their costs. So I kept quiet. I stopped the barn repairs for a while, made a few calls, pulled a few strings. If they wanted to make life harder for me, I was about to return the favor, but legally and with a smile. Let's just say, when the next utility bill hit their mailboxes, a lot of people were in for a surprise, and that's when things really got interesting. Now, before you think I went full villain mode, let me explain a bit about how we got here. This neighborhood wasn't always run by a bunch of clipboard-wielding rule enforcers. When I moved here nearly 10 years ago, it was peaceful, quiet, and neighborly. The HOA back then mostly stayed out of people's business. But over time, things changed. A few new folks moved in, got on the board, and suddenly they wanted to control everything. From the color of your front door to how long your car could be in the driveway. The barn had always been there. It stood before the roads were paved. Before the new houses came up, before there even was an HOA, it sat on a corner of my land, half hidden by old trees, and honestly, most people forgot it was even there. But the moment I started restoring it, cleaning up the area, putting in a few support beams, painting the old red boards, it suddenly became a violation. They claimed I was disrupting the aesthetic of the neighborhood. But here's the part they didn't know. My job involves working with local municipalities and utility companies. I've helped plan energy grids, run water lines, and even consulted on pricing strategies for neighborhoods like ours. So when they started throwing rules at me, I saw a bigger picture. Most HEAs don't realize how connected their decisions are to things like energy efficiency, incentives, or infrastructure upgrades. One phone call about removing a planned improvement project could quietly shift the costs. So, while they were busy writing me up for unauthorized construction, I was reviewing their energy usage reports and talking to a few old contacts. I wasn't breaking any laws, I was just letting the system work in a slightly different direction, and trust me, they didn't see it coming. The weirdest part was, it wasn't even the whole neighborhood that had a problem with the barn, just a small group on the HOA board. A couple of my neighbors even came by and said they liked what I was doing. One guy told me he remembered the barn from when he was a kid and was glad someone was finally taking care of it. But the board, they were determined to make an example out of me. They sent formal warnings, fined me, and even posted pictures of the violation in the community newsletter like I was running some kind of criminal operation. The more pressure they put on me, the more they exposed just how little they understood about how things really worked behind the scenes. I knew, for instance, that our area had recently been up for a utility modernization grant, one that I had helped write a recommendation for. That grant was what was keeping rates low for the community. It was meant to cover upgrades that would have made the grid more efficient, especially during peak seasons. But here's the catch, continued. Eligibility depended on local cooperation and residential compliance with certain standards. And once I started pulling at those threads, well, let's just say it didn't take much for those standards to slip, especially when people started filing complaints and drawing attention to the internal dysfunction. Meanwhile, the board doubled down. They started inspecting other homes, issuing citations for tiny things like garden heights or mailbox colors, trying to show they were fair and consistent. But all they did was stir up more resentment. More homeowners started questioning them, showing up at meetings, and asking why their bills were suddenly creeping up, and I still hadn't touched the barn again. Not yet. It didn't take long before things started to boil over. By the third month's energy bills had spiked across the entire neighborhood. People were confused, frustrated, and starting to talk. I'd hear murmurs at the local coffee shop and at the grocery store folks, asking if anyone else's power bill nearly doubled. A few even thought it was a mistake. But it wasn't. It was just the result of a few planned efficiency upgrades. Being delayed indefinitely due to compliance concerns language I helped draft. Nothing illegal, nothing sneaky. Just policy doing what policy does when red tape gets pulled tight. At the same time, the HOA meetings got messier. Residents started pushing back, demanding answers. One woman, a single mom living 3 houses down, stood up and asked why she was being fined for having her trash bins out a few hours too early, while her electric bill had gone up 50%. The board gave her the usual runaround policy guidelines but people weren't buying it anymore. You could feel the tension rising like pressure in a sealed tank. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. Still hadn't picked up my hammer. Just went about my day like everything was fine. But inside, I was tracking every move. I watched as 3 of the 5 board members stopped showing up in person, switching to remote calls. Rumors started spreading that one of them was trying to sell their house. Another one apparently got flagged for making unauthorized improvements to their backyards, something they'd find others for. And just when it seemed like they were starting to sweat, the HOA sent me one final notice, an official cease and desist letter. They said if I touched the barn again, they'd escalate it to legal action. That's when I knew the next move had to count. A few days after I got that cease and desist letter, something strange happened. I came home from work and noticed tire tracks in the gravel that didn't match mine. At first, I brushed it off, maybe a delivery guy turned around in the driveway. But then I saw the side gate to the barn was unlatched. I always keep it locked. Always. When I walked over, I found one of the support beams I had leaned up against. The inside wall, tossed on the ground, snapped in half like someone had tried to break it deliberately. That's when it hit me someone had been snooping around. I didn't have proof, and I wasn't about to start making wild accusations. But it felt more like intimidation than coincidence. I made a report, changed the locks, and installed a couple of discreet security cameras. I figured if they were bold enough to threaten legal action, maybe they were bold enough to try something else, too. At the next HOA meeting, things completely unraveled. Residents were furious. Not just about utilities or nitpicky fines, but about a sudden special assessment fee the board announced to cover administrative costs related to non-compliance issues. People were yelling, walking out, demanding resignations. That's when a neighbor of mine, retired Air Force guy named Jim, stood up and dropped a bombshell. He had pulled the HOA's financial records under the state's public disclosure law and found a chunk of money spent on a private legal retainer. Turns out, they'd been quietly preparing to sue me, using neighborhood dues to fund it. Now the board wasn't just losing control, they were being questioned on everything. Trust was gone. And I knew, at that moment, this wasn't just about a barn anymore. It had turned into something much bigger. After that chaotic meeting, things moved fast. Within a week, nearly half the neighborhood had signed a petition demanding a vote to dissolve the current HOA board. People who had never even attended a meeting before were suddenly active, trading notes, sharing copies of fines, and comparing how far things had spiraled. The local news even picked up the story: historic barn sparks power struggle in suburban HOA. I didn't ask for the attention, but at that point, the spotlight was already there. Then something I never expected happened. One of the board members, the treasurer, reached out to me directly. She asked to meet in person. I was skeptical, but agreed. Public place, middle of the day. Over coffee, she admitted she hadn't agreed with how far things had gone. She had originally supported the complaint, thinking it was just a zoning thing, but had no idea they were planning to sue me or quietly adjust the budget to make it happen. She handed me a folder copies of emails, invoices, and internal memos. It was all the proof anyone needed. The neighborhood held an emergency vote. The board was removed. All of them. And just like that, the power shifted. Not just utility-wise, but in every sense of the word. The new interim committee reversed the fines, reinstated improvement approvals, and even offered me an apology. I finally went back to the barn, toolbox in hand, and got to work this time, no one standing in my way. But here's the twist. While sorting through old files in the barn's storage room, I found something none of us expected: original land deeds and survey maps, proving the HOA had technically been managing a boundary they didn't own. Let's just say that story is still unfolding. After I found those old land documents, I had them reviewed by a property lawyer just to be sure. Turned out several parts of the neighborhood, mainly the common areas and part of the walking trail, were technically on land my family had never signed over. No one had caught it because the original deeds were buried deep in county records. And most of the modern property lines were based on assumptions made decades ago. It wasn't a huge legal mess, but it was enough to shake things up and force a full reassessment of the HOA's control. In the end, the new leadership approached things with more transparency. They involved actual residents in decisions, restructured the rules to make them fairer, and most importantly, stopped acting like they ran a gated kingdom. The special assessment fees were dropped. Energy rates returned to normal after the delayed upgrades were reinstated. And neighbors who had felt bullied finally started to speak up without fear of being targeted. As for me, the barn restoration is finally moving forward. It's slow work, but every nail and board feels like part of a bigger win. What started as a quiet weekend project became a full-blown fight for fairness and common sense. Funny how something as simple as fixing an old barn could stir up so much, but maybe it needed to happen. People got reminded that community isn't built through power plays, it's built through trust and respect. So yeah, it's a barn standing tall again, and this time it's more than just a building. It's a reminder that sometimes standing your ground even with a hammer in hand can be the start of something bigger, something worth fighting for.